So we're going to go through some watercolor techniques, and to start you're going to want to draw a 12 square grid. And I have an example of a finished grid with the techniques already completed attached to this assignment on Classroom. What you're looking at now is the beginning stages, and I've labeled everything, so please refer to the attachment on Classroom for the labels. To start, you're going to measure out 2 by 2 inch squares, and I like to start by estimating about a 1/2 inch from the edge, placing my ruler parallel to the edge of the paper. I'll draw a line, and then on the other end, just for fun, I'm going to measure out the 1/2 inch, always making 2 marks on opposite ends of the paper in order to connect the dots and make a straight line. So basically I'm just creating a 1/2 inch margin on 2 sides of my grid. Next, I'm going to measure out every 2 inches. I'm going to make a mark, the 2 and the 4 and the 6 and the 8. And again, sliding my ruler down and making the same marks at the 2, the 4, the 6, and the 8. And just so you know, the sample that I'm going to be using today is actually 2.5 inch squares. They're 2.5 inches tall and 2 inches wide. But that's just because I had a bigger piece of paper and I thought it might be easier for you to see on the demo. But hopefully you're doing this in your journal, in which case you want to stick with the 2 by 2 inch squares. All right, now that your grid is drawn out, I'm going to move to the second piece of paper, which already has the labels written out. And so again, you can refer to this or to the attachment on Classroom. Now the first one that we're going to do is wet on wet. That's the first technique. And you're going to start with water, just clear water to get your paper wet. And then you're going to take a nice watery bit of watercolor and paint it on. I'm going to go with a couple different colors. You can use one or more. And notice how when you place watercolor down on top of a wet piece of paper, the color immediately starts to bloom and blend in with the water. It travels across the paper. Next, we're going to do scumble. So scumble, again, is using fairly wet watercolor. But instead of making the paper wet first, you're going to put the watery color down. And it's important that you use at least 2 or 3 colors for this and allow the colors to kind of blend into each other, but not all the way, so they still maintain their own integrity. These colors could be useful if you're doing a landscape, a fall landscape, if you wanted to capture the autumn colors. I'll bring some green in as well. All right, so there's scumble. And now we're going to move on to color on color. So I'm going to start by filling the square with one color, a base coat, which is one way of doing it. You don't have to fill the whole square. And then I'm going to take a different brush with a different color and paint it right on top. And while it's still wet, you're going to see how the color blends in pretty easily. And again, it blooms and blends into the color. But instead of using clear water, we're using wet paint. Next is water blooms. Oh, and also notice how on the right side where the yellow paint has already become fairly dry, the lines are easier to see, they're more distinguished. Whereas the wetter side on the left, the blue has blended in. All right, so water blooms, we start with one color. And as you can see, my watercolors haven't been used in a while and they were a little pretty dry, so I'm having to use a lot of water to get the pigment activated, which is fine, except in this case, I'd get a more dramatic effect if I didn't have so much water in the paint to begin with. But you still can see the blooms, so I'm just dripping clear, well, in this case muddy water, onto the green square. All right, next is graffito, and for this you're going to need a needle or a pin, a thumbtack, something sharp that you can make marks with in the paper. So I'm going to just draw some lines with my pin. And I think I'll do a few pinpricks too, just to see if they turn out. And now I'm going to put a clear coat. And when you do this, it will work the best, I think, if you don't put too many layers on top of that. Again, I'm struggling to get the pigment to come up in my own watercolor set. But you should be able to start to see how the pigment will settle into the lines that you've scratched into the paper. All right, dry brush is next. And I can tell my watercolors are pretty wet, so I'm not going to get a super dry brush effect. But I'll do the best I can. Go with some orange, which is now turning brown because it's mixed with the green. So just making some marks. So just be aware that with less water, you can get more distinct texture and marks. All right, now we're going to move on to solid wash, which is pretty basic. I'm just going to fill the box with a solid wash of color. And it'll look pretty flat. Next is graded wash, and we're going to move from dark to light. And just going back into this graffito for a sec to see if I might be able to bring more of that pigment in to the etched lines. All right, so graded wash, we're going light to dark. That color already is pretty light, so maybe I'll go for a different color. So this is one way to do a gradation, going from one color to another. I've got my blue to my green, but I'd rather show you how to go from light to dark. So I'm actually going to pull out some of that blue to make it lighter on the left side. So it's another technique you can be aware of. It's very easy to blot color if you get it right away and it hasn't soaked into the paper. So I'm going to go back and make that transition more gradual, add a little bit more darker color on the right. I'm even bringing in a different green. All right, so there's my graded wash. A little more touching up. Okay, so next is going to be glazing. And, oh, wait, I'm going to play with this one more time. There, you should be able to see the lines now pretty clearly. Okay, so glazing. I'm just going to do one base coat, one solid wash to start, and then I'm going to have to let it dry because for glazing, it's wet on dry, basically. So there's my orange, and I will let it sit while I move on to wipe out. So wipe out, I'll just do another solid wash. I think I'll do this reddish purple, alizarin crimson. And then you can use a dry brush to wipe out, or this handy dandy tissue that I have. And so the tissue blots it, and you have less control over it. So I recommend playing with a dry brush as well. I don't have one right now, but that would be good. Okay, so next is tape. I've previously placed down some masking tape to make a little design, and I'm going to paint over that tape. I recommend not using Scotch tape because it's super sticky and it'll pull up on your paper fibers and give you kind of a rough look to your paper. So, because I am going to pull this tape up once the paint is dry, and so that's always fun to see what marks were left by the tape. Once you pull it up, you will just have white marks. So doing a gradation for fun, purple into blue. You can use a solid color or multicolors. You could scumble over this. You can mix techniques. You could do dry brush over it. All right, and last but not least, crumpled tissue. So putting down some yellow and a little bit of orange. I generally find that blending more than one color is much more interesting and lively, engaging once it's dry. All right, crumpling up my tissue, make it nice and bumpy. I'm just going to dab at the paint to give some texture to it. Do the lightest in the center, and that's it. All right, checking my orange to see if it's dry. It needs to be completely dry, and you can see the lines in this graffito are more visible now. All right, and we see graded wash is dry, and because there's so much water in my paint, I'm getting a very free-form kind of natural watery look to the edge, which you might see the more water you use, the paint will go in this forming a kind of jaggedy edge that's reminiscent of the way water forms rivers and streams. Okay, glazing line over. Glazing's one of my favorites because you still can see the color underneath, but it kind of glows through the darker color on top. All right, that's it. Have fun. I will look forward to seeing your pieces in class.